I wanted to welcome you all to the Washington State Library's First Tuesday webinar. It's a monthly webinar we hold on, guess what, the first Tuesday of the month. So if this is new to you, you should check back and see what else we offer. So let me go through our slides. So I am your facilitator here. My name is Nona Burling. For technical support, we have Jeremy Stroud and Joe Olivar. And Jeremy and Joe, would you put your contact information into the chat? And so in case anyone has any trouble, you can contact either of them by phone or by email, and they will help you out. So I wanted to let you know that this webinar is brought to you by the Washington State Library, which is part of the Office of Secretary of State and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So I wanted to introduce to you today, our topic is financial literacy, fact versus fiction. And we have a team of 4 people from the Federal Trade Commission today who are speaking for us. So first we have Tina Kondo. I don't know if first is the order they're going to come in, but the people I'm introducing are Tina Kondo, and she is the Assistant Regional Director of the FTC's Northwest Regional Office in Seattle. Prior to joining the FTC in 2014, she was the Deputy Attorney General with the Washington State Attorney General's Office, overseeing several divisions of Consumer Protection Division. At the FTC, she also supervises attorneys and investigators who investigate and litigate consumer protection and competition cases. Next, we have Richard McEwen, and he is an attorney who investigates and litigates false advertising, fraud, debt collection, and telemarketing cases. Mr. McEwen has served as an attorney advisor to an FTC commissioner on consumer protection issues and spent several years in the agency's Office of International Affairs and the Division of Marketing Practices. He has a JD from NYU School of Law and an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center. Next, we have Nadine Samter, and she is an attorney who investigates and litigates cases involving telemarketing fraud, fraudulent business opportunities and investments, predatory lending, mortgage fraud, credit reporting, debt collection, privacy law, and fraudulent advertising. It makes me exhausted just to read that list. Ms. Samter served as an attorney advisor to an FTC commissioner and worked in the Division of Credit Practices. She was an associate at Hogan and Hartson in Washington, D.C., where her practice focused on antitrust law and general litigation. She has a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. And finally, we have Loa Solis, and she is an attorney who's filed several lawsuits, including those involving business practices that target underserved communities. She's received several awards for her work protecting the nation's consumers. Before joining the FTC, Ms. Solis was an associate at Perkins Cole LLP. She graduated from University of Washington School of Law in 2004 and received her BA cum laude in political science and American ethnic studies, sorry about that, from the University of Washington in 1999. And now I'm going to stop talking and let the people who you came here to hear take over. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Nono, and thank you to Jeremy and Joe for providing technical help for us this morning. We're really excited to be here and to have the opportunity to reach a statewide audience through the State Library. So we're glad that you could all join us here this morning. Today we're going to talk about financial scams and how the lack of financial awareness can make consumers, who are otherwise known as your library patrons, or maybe yourselves, can be susceptible to all sorts of financial scams. I want to spend a second talking about the Federal Trade Commission and who we are, because there's a common misconception that the Federal Trade Commission regulates exports and imports. In fact, just the other day, somebody asked me what I thought about the proposed trade deal, and I said I didn't know anything about it. We actually are a regulator of domestic trade in the sense that we regulate to make sure that businesses are not basically scamming consumers or competing unfairly. So that's what we do. And we're an independent commission, which means that we're bipartisan. Currently, we have one Democrat and one Republican serving as commissioners, and that will probably change fairly soon, but we do remain a bipartisan commission. We've been protecting consumers since 1914, and here in Seattle, or up in Seattle, we've had an office since 1925. So I've been here quite a long time and developed a lot of expertise. And one thing I want to note is that we do have materials that are available in Spanish as well as other languages. All of our materials are available for free, which is something that I think most libraries like. If you get onto our website, ftc.gov, you'll see our consumer information, and you'll see all of the information that we have available. And everything we talk about here today will be available on our website. We want to partner with our community members to get our information out to the public, and we see libraries as being one of our primary partners to get the word out. So today, as Nono mentioned, we have 4 different presenters, and we've divided our content into 4 different sections. I'm going to give you some unfortunate data on just how many Washington consumers are the victims of financial scams in 1 year, and what kinds of financial scams are prevalent here. Richard McEwen will talk about the importance of financial literacy and the FTC's resources available to help your patrons work toward financial literacy. Nadine Samter is our expert on debt and credit issues. She's going to talk about how debt and credit issues impact consumers and what resources the FTC can give you to help people address those issues. And finally, Laura Solis will focus on some of the most common scams that target our most vulnerable populations, things like job and employment and educational or school scams. And we're especially happy to be here this week because it's National Consumer Protection Week. And each year the FTC and our partners, such as state libraries or the Better Business Bureau and state AG's offices, work together to target stakeholders in the consumer protection community. And we help share resources that will educate consumers. In addition to today's library webinar, the FTC has been doing a series of consumer webinars throughout the country for all consumer stakeholders, not just libraries. So we will let the Secretary of State's office or the library know when we get the schedule for the webinar that will be held in Washington. And you can help us get the word out. We're also happy to announce that just last week, we released our Consumer Sentinel data book that gave us updated statistics that we'll report on here today. So let's go ahead and get started with some of that. So let's look at some of the unfortunate facts about fraud reports in Washington. We have a database called Consumer Sentinel. Consumer Sentinel is a massive system of consumer complaints that's shared by law enforcement partners throughout the country. So if someone complains, for example, to an attorney general's office, their complaint probably ended up in our Consumer Sentinel database. And this is one of the things that helps us target our defendants. You can see, well, you probably can't see, but it's very small writing, but I want to emphasize for you here that Washington, in the list of states that reported fraud in 2017, Washington ranked at number 25, which is just about where you'd expect us to be because Washington's about 2% of the population. So it's about what you would expect. But if you look at the numbers of fraud reports we heard in 2017, you'll see that we got 38,000 reports of fraud in 2017. Our data also showed that in Washington, the total amount paid to reported fraudsters in 2017 was $17.8 million. With a median loss of $460 per person reporting. That's quite high. So how did consumers get our money? According to Consumer Sentinel, these were the top categories with respect to financial frauds in Washington. Imposters, this is IRS or government agency imposters, identity theft, debt collection, prizes, sweepstakes, and lotteries, and what we call credit bureau and information furnishers and users, which I think Nadine's going to talk about later. Comparing our data to the nationwide data, we can see that Washington consumers have the same scams, are subject to the same scams as everywhere else in the country. And comparing our 2016 data to the 2017 data that was just released, the categories really don't change. The top 5 are the same. They might flip-flop a little bit in terms of 1, 2, or 3, but they're pretty much the same. So let's drill down on each of these. Let's talk first about imposter scams. What's an imposter scam? It's just what it says. It's when somebody calls and says that they're someone that they're not. And this was Washington's #1 complaint in 2017. Nationwide, there are about 347,000 complaints. We have a flyer here. You can see on the right. This is something that's available for free as a tear sheet for you or your patrons. If you think you might benefit from this, you can get this from our website. And excuse me, one of the most common red flags with an imposter scam is that the caller will ask you to pay by wire or debit card or iTunes or some sort of immediate payment. And they also emphasize that there's some urgency to the problem. So let's look at some of the fictions or the things that people tell you when they're pretending to be someone they're not. They could call they could call saying that they're from the IRS. And right now, because it's tax season, IRS scams are a very, very common thing. You know, they call and they say, you owe us money, you owe back taxes, there's some sort of problem, you have a penalty. Housing lotteries. This is when somebody calls and says, you know, we can help you increase your odds of winning. We have a way to help you do that. You just have to pay us a certain amount of money and we'll help you get into that Section 8 housing that you might want. Another common scam is a utility scam, and this is one that's often aimed at small businesses, where someone will call threatening to shut the power off if they don't pay a fee that's supposedly owed for back payment. And because most small businesses can't afford to have their power shut off for even a day, they might succumb to this scam. An educational grant is a scam where they call and they say they're from the Department of Education or some other educational institution, and for a fee, they can help you get a grant. We've heard about Social Security scams. We've heard about scammers impersonating the Federal Trade Commission, saying that they're offering to help the consumer, but you just have to pay a small fee. One of the things that we heard last year in King County that was fairly common was a juror scam. And this was a scam where people would get called saying that there was going to be a warrant out for their arrest, they hadn't shown up for jury duty, and they needed to pay a fee for that. And the King County court actually had a blurb on their website warning people against this juror scam. Because of the recent disasters that we've experienced across the country, we're also hearing about FEMA scams, where people impersonate FEMA and say that they can help you, but you have to pay a fee in order to do that. Property taxes and mortgage scams, same sort of thing. The final thing is mandatory posters. This is a very common scam where a small business will be contacted saying, the scammers calling from the Department of Labor and Industries or the Department of Transportation, and they're required to be posting certain notices in their businesses, and they can supply these posters for a certain amount of money. So remember, when you hear phone calls from people pretending to be from a government agency, there are some things that you can bear in mind. First of all, government agencies rarely, if ever, call people asking for money for back payments. Secondly, whenever anybody calls asking for, whether it's an imposter scam or any other kind of call, if you're asked to pay by wire transfer or iTunes gift card or Green Dot or MoneyGram, chances are that's a scam. Now let's talk about identity theft. Even though identity theft is number 3 in the number of complaints, it can potentially do more harm than any of the other ones because it can do so much long-term damage. We like to say there are only 2 types of people in the world: people who've had their identity stolen or people who are going to have their identity stolen. Here's some of the statistics on this slide that show you where Washington is in terms of the numbers. We had over 7,000 reports of identity theft in 2017 alone. And that can involve stolen Social Security numbers or credit card theft. And the research has shown, or I heard this at an IRS seminar last year from some investigators who do nothing but specialize in trying to hunt down IRS imposters and Social Security theft. The value of your identity now on the dark web, which is where the criminals hang out, is less than $1 now. So think of all of the trouble it causes you to have someone steal your identity when somebody has bought your identity for less than $1 on the dark web. And if you look at the state rankings for identity theft, you can see here where Washington ranks. Again, you probably can't read this on your computers, but Washington is hanging out there at about number 16 for identity theft reports from 2017. And I'm not really sure why, but I do think that Washington, because we're a very high-tech population and people that tend to be online a lot, that tends to be an invitation for identity theft. And you know, the internet is one of the prime places where people find your identity. If we break down the identity theft complaints by age, and I don't have 2017 on here, but the statistics are very comparable from year to year, as you can see. Identity thefts don't discriminate. They'll steal from anybody whose information they can grab. But you can see from the statistics that theft tends to be lower for consumers under 19, primarily because their personal information isn't as available. They're not using credit cards because they don't have them yet. And for very young teens, they don't have driver's licenses yet. Similarly, for older adults, the information tends to be less available because they're just simply not on the internet as much. So what do you do if you're a victim of identity theft? The FTC has free identity theft resources. You can go to identitytheft.gov to find these free resources, and we also have a recovery plan there. For all of our free resources, if you just go to ftc.gov/bulk order, you can see a whole list of all of the free materials we have that you're welcome to take and either put in your library or direct your patrons to these websites so they can order them for themselves. People are welcome to co-brand with us. For example, if you have an association or an organization that wants to download our materials and then put their logo on it, they're more than welcome to do that. We have examples of letters to write and reports to make with respect to identity theft. And we've now integrated our system with the IRS reporting system for tax identity theft. So I would say in terms of the things I'm talking about here today, if there's one packet of resources that you choose to grab for your libraries, it would be these free identity theft resources, because we find that they're one of the most popular things that we commonly hand out. Let's talk next about debt collection and debt scams. There are two aspects to these kinds of complaints. First, consumers complain because debt collectors are violating debt collection laws by doing things like harassing consumers, contacting your employer, calling late at night. The second type of complaint in this category tends to be collection on fake debt. And how does that occur? Callers might claim that someone owes a debt that was either paid or is no longer valid because it's beyond the statute of limitations and it's so old. And the callers will make threats and sometimes combine with a claim that they're calling from the government. Sometimes the debt could be related to another type of scam. For example, you ordered a beauty product online and you didn't order, and then years later you get a call asking to pay for an old debt. So, you know, these scammers don't stop at just one scam. They like to combine them as well. Next, let's talk about prizes, sweepstakes, and lottery scams. You can see the number of nationwide complaints we got and the high number of dollar volume of losses. These are the scams where they call and say, oh, you've won a prize or a sweepstakes, and all you have to do is pay us a $20 processing fee or a $10 processing fee. Or they can say you can pay us by some sort of instant cash transfer method like iTunes or Green Dot or wire transfers. The scammers rarely, if ever, award these prizes. And Richard just sued somebody who was running this kind of game, and they were taking millions of dollars from elderly consumers. So that's another area we want to educate consumers about. And the final thing I'll talk about today is credit information and reports. You can see the number of nationwide scams or complaints we saw last year. This includes problems with credit bureaus reporting incorrect information about a consumer. We might see an uptick in this category next year because of the Equifax breach. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time between a time a breach happens and the consumer gets impacted by it. But you can see here just how large the problem is, and I think Nadine's going to talk a little bit more about credit and debt issues. So now that you've seen some of the grim statistics about how prevalent fraud is in Washington, we want to give you some of the tools for preventing fraud and what to do if you feel like you've been scammed. And to start with, Richard McEwen is going to talk a little bit about financial literacy and some of the tools that we have available for your use.
Hi, everybody. I'm Richard. Happy to be here. So what I thought I would talk about today are some tools that the FTC has to help you help others, or for you to help yourself. And I'm going to first talk about our website, consumer.ftc.gov, and what sort of materials are on there. Then I'm going to talk about another website that we maintain, which is just consumer.gov. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how you can actually get hard copies of materials, of the educational materials that we have. Not everything is available in hard copy. A lot of stuff you have to download yourself and print out, but we do have stuff that we'll print for you and ship to you for free, as many copies as you'd like. Now, so these three websites that we maintain, they're geared towards different audiences. Our first one, consumer.ftc.gov, here's a screenshot of it. And you can see it covers a number of different topics, some of which Tina's already talked about. You can see across the top, money and credit, health and fitness, privacy, identity, all those sorts of things. You can click through and explore these topics. You can see that there is links to multimedia. We have videos on here. We have blog posts. We have all sorts of information on here. You can subscribe to have stuff directed into your inbox every day, you name it. And so if I were to just sort of click through here to the tab at the top that says money and credit, I drill down a little bit, and here's more specific information about money and credit. Information, say there in the middle, you can see how to shop smartly, how to save money, some tips on buying and owning a car, etc. Now, all this information that is at consumer.ftc.gov is geared towards people with, say, a high school education or maybe a high school education plus. We try to keep it, focused, keep it simple, keep it so it's, understandable by a pretty wide swath of the population. The next website I'm going to talk about, consumer.gov, you're going to notice right away it looks quite a bit different. And consumer.gov is a lot more pared down, a lot more bare bones, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean it in the sense that it's simplified. And in fact, we worked with the Center for Applied Linguistics to develop this website, and it's geared to people who have a 10th grade education. And then we also try to gear it towards people who English may not be their first language. So it's a lot more simpler, a lot more easier to navigate, not so many things to sort of distract you when you look at it, not lots of things to click on to drill down, and et cetera. And you can see, once again, there's the 3 tabs across the top, and you can sort of drill down into those. The 4th tab across the top, Toolbox, is actually for people who are interested in making this information available to others, say for educators who want to use this in class, or people who are leading discussions at community groups and things like that. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But first, so for example, if I were to click on the Managing Your Money tab at the top, or on that Manage and Use Your Money Wisely bar in the middle, it's going to take me down to this, which is just a straightforward list of topics that you can drill through. It's, like I said, it's very simplified, and it tries to keep it as easy to follow as possible without getting into too many details or distractions. So what I do when I'm sort of talking to community groups, and it can be a group of seniors where I've presented for at a community center. I've gone out to prisons and presented to the reentry community. I've gone to high schools and talked to high school kids about stuff like this. And I use this website as the starting point, and then I build onto it in my presentation. And one of the things I actually like to do is I like to try to make my presentations as interactive as possible and as interesting for the audience. And so I have actually, with the help of some other folks at the FTC, developed a PowerPoint game, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And then you can see a little asterisk there. It's, okay, not really a millionaire, but it's a good reminder to always read the fine print. And what I do with this is I try to just rather than just throwing information at the audience, is I immediately jump into this game and start dividing the group into teams and asking them questions. And so my first question, or one of my easy beginning questions here, is Sophia is trying to come up with a monthly budget for when she gets out. This is actually towards the, I gave this at, to some of the inmates at Purdy a couple of months ago. And so she's trying to come up with a monthly budget for when she gets out. Which of the following would not be considered a fixed expense? A grocery bill, a car payment, car insurance, or rent? So, you know, it gives the audience the opportunity to discuss and figure out what the correct answer is. And hopefully they are able to deduce that the correct answer is a grocery bill. And then what I do then is I go into the toolbox, and this is in the toolbox on consumer.gov. And it's Sophia starts a budget. And then, you know, I give this handout to the class and we talk about how to draft a budget and ways that say with fixed expenses, you can't really save money, but with variable expenses, you can find ways to save money. Next question, Marcella lands a job paying $400 a week. On her budget worksheet, she should put down $1,600 as her monthly income. True or false? Once again, you know, let the audience discuss this a little bit, and usually they come to the right answer. That it's false. You don't put that down as your income on your budget. Why not? Well, it's because you have deductions, you have taxes, maybe your wages are garnished. There may be any number of reasons why your paycheck is going to be less than what you actually earn in total. Then we pull out our budget sheets, and once again, you can order these. We can send you boxes of these for free, or you can print them out yourself online. And we figure out how to make a budget, filling in the income this month, etc. So if you are leading a workshop about these topics, once again, this is in the toolbox. It gives you even more detailed teacher's notes that you can use to help structure your presentation. We also have some very fancy objectives and standards that you can use as well. If you want to, you can look at the columns here, left and right. The right is for more basic beginning students, people say with limited language capabilities, or people who don't have as high education level. On the left, you can have your lesson plan for people who are have a higher education level. Another question, Jessica's bank offers her a credit card. Before she agrees, one of the most important questions she should ask is, can I get the Seahawks logo on it? Does it come in a color that matches my handbag? What are the fees? Or can I have the bill sent to my ex? And the idea with these questions is not to make them so hard that people can't get them. You want them to sort of have fun with it. And of course, the answer is, what are the fees? For these sorts of questions, as they get progressively more difficult, this is one of my favorite publications that I use in my presentations, and it's focused on finances. It's geared towards college-age kids, people who have graduated from high school with maybe a little bit more education, and it's about getting out of their parents' home and getting started on their own. So it covers things on how to rent an apartment, how to buy a car, how to make a budget, credit skills 101, etc. So one of the things that's discussed in this publication is how to use a credit card and things to ask and look for, and how to examine the fine print, figure out what the annual fees are, etc. Another more difficult question, Jessica decides to celebrate her birthday in Las Vegas. She charges $500 in airfare and $500 for a hotel on her credit card. If she pays only the minimum payment each month and doesn't use the card again, how long can she expect it to take to pay for her mini vacation? Now, the idea here isn't to make them actually do complicated math. Rather, the idea is just to get them thinking about these things that they might not have thought about when they're out there spending money on their credit card. If you put $1,000 on a credit card, and if we assume that's a 12% interest rate, and we assume that the minimum payment is 2% of the balance, it's going to take 8 years to pay off that little mini vacation if you just make the minimum payment. So once again, turning back to the Focus on Finances publication, this explains the math in a little more detail. It tells you how long it's going to take to pay off that debt. The last thing I'm going to talk about is our bulk order website. This is ftc.gov/bulk order. And everything that we produce in hard copy is available here. And you can see up in the upper right-hand corner, it says en español. Everything that we produce in hard copy is also available in Spanish hard copy. And then if you drill down, for example, if I click on the consumer.gov education sample pack here, oops, did I not put that up? Oh, sorry, I thought I put down. Well, if you drill down into these, you can find the actual publications that I've just talked about. You can order them. If it's not available on hard copy, you're welcome to print it out yourself and use it yourself. But most of the stuff is available here on hard copy. You just have to give yourself plenty of lead time if you order. It can take up to 4 to 6 weeks to actually get some of this stuff. Some of the items aren't actually maintained in stock. Like once you order it, then they actually print them out and ship it to you. So it can take a while. So definitely give yourself at least 4 weeks if you are ordering materials from the website. And with that, I will turn it over to Nadine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and for giving us an opportunity to share some of this information with you. As promised, I'm here to talk about debt collection and credit issues. Now, Tina talked about what type of collection problems and credit bureau problems there are. I'm going to provide a little practical advice about what to do because oftentimes libraries are the first places people go to get information about what to do when they're having financial problems. So I'm going to go through a series of questions which are probably the most common questions that you will hear and give you some quick answers that you can give them, and then also point you to resources that we have on our website, either for bulk order or that you can just pull up to help them resolve what their particular issue is. So often people come in saying, hey, debt collectors keep calling me, what do I do? So some practical advice is, first of all, they need to write everything down because they need to keep a record of who they're talking to and what these debts are, because oftentimes, as I'll talk about later, these may not be real debts. So the first thing they need to do is tell the collector, I'm only going to talk to you when I get written validation notice showing what I owe, who I owe it to, and when I first owed this debt. They also need to know that they don't have to be on the phone with people who are threatening to do something they can't legally do. Tina had talked about, threats such as violent threats or profanity or anything like that. But this also includes legal threats. So if they don't intend to sue, they can't threaten to sue, and they can't tell your children or third parties about the debt. It's all against the law, and they don't have to stay on the phone for that. So the next question invariably is, how do I make them stop calling me? Well, whether or not you owe a debt, you don't have to receive calls from debt collectors. So the way that in the law that they can do this is write a cease notice letter. And that's a letter telling the debt collectors to stop calling. In the resource materials that I'm going to show you, there are sample letters that they can use. We recommend that even though it costs money, it is worthwhile to send by certified mail with a return receipt to ensure that you can prove that you sent the letter. And the law does require the calls to stop, but it doesn't, but you ought to tell people that just by getting a collector to stop calling doesn't mean the debt collector can't still sue or, seek other legal remedies if those remedies are lawful. So what do I do when I get the validation notice? So assuming that the debt's real and the debt collector sends you a validation notice, it should list the creditor, and this is the time when the consumer can figure out whether it may be a real debt. And if they don't believe the debt is theirs, they can follow the instructions on the notice, because a proper notice, a validation notice, should tell them what to do next. And if the debt is theirs, they can start figuring out how to pay for it, or talk to a credit counselor to help them figure out how to deal with that debt. So one of the best resources we have online, which is very comprehensive, is this debt collection booklet. You can get it online or in bulk order, and it is one of those things that I recommend really having on hand. it's a great booklet that contains pretty much anything that the consumer might want to know about how to deal with debt collectors and debt collection. We also have a couple others that are really good to have. The Coping with Debt, which actually helps, I believe, work out payment plans. And then choosing a credit counselor, which is a really important thing because there are a lot of people out there posing as credit counselors and offering credit repair services that are scams. So this booklet, which you can also obtain online, will help a person discern who might be an appropriate person for them to deal with for credit. And one of the things that we tell people is they're not anyone who's offering to help you resolve credit should never ever charge you an advance fee. That is illegal, and so that's one of the key flags for whether someone is legitimate. And so, as I was saying, consumers need to beware companies that offer to fix credit or reduce the debt for a fee in advance. Often they will offer to enroll consumers in loan forgiveness or reduced payment plans. And one of the biggest areas we're seeing now is student loans, where they claim that they can get loan forgiveness and other types of relief from student loan debt. And there are other materials for that on the Department of Education's website. But what we tell people is it doesn't cost anything to renegotiate or get loan forgiveness from the Department of Education, and it can only be done through the Department of Education. So companies that offer to enroll consumers in loan forgiveness programs are almost always a scam. We also have a booklet on credit repair, how to fix your credit, because as I will get into in a moment, you can't really have a debt collection problem without also having a credit problem. So one of the things though that comes up for consumers, and this is where we see areas where consumers may have an issue as to whether or not they really owe the debt. Sometimes there are debt collectors who will buy up old debt for pennies on the dollar. And the reality is they only have a limited amount of time to collect a debt. And then the debt becomes out of statute, which means that legally they can't sue on the debt anymore. Washington gives written contracts and accounts receivable 6 years before the unpaid debt becomes time barred. If you're in another state, that time may vary. But typically the clock starts on the time period when the consumer fails to make a payment. And a debt collector they can still attempt to collect a debt, but they can't threaten to sue and they can't take legal action for what we call time barred debts. They can call for time barred debts, but consumers can go through the whole process that I originally told you about to get them to stop calling. Oftentimes consumers ask, well, I may have once owed the debt, but I don't, but it's old. We don't ever tell people not to pay their debts if they owed them, but in a time barred debt, it really shouldn't lower your credit score if it's past the credit reporting period. But in general, we don't tell people not to pay debts, but they're not legally required to pay time barred debts. If a person does agree to make a partial payment, they need to know that in some states that can revive the debt. So I think if a person's in doubt, you might tell them to make sure that, even making a partial payment may make the whole process start off again. But if they do decide to pay off the debt, they should make sure to get a release for the debt before paying it back. Otherwise, that record of the debt can be resold and another debt collection company may come back and say they still owe it. Oftentimes what we see are debt collectors will sue people, and oftentimes people won't get notice or they'll ignore the notice because they won't know what to do. Even if the debt is time barred, some debt collection mills will still file lawsuits, and the only way you can actually get those dismissed is if the person shows and comes with evidence that it's time barred. If that's the case, then the judge will dismiss the lawsuit, but really never ignore a lawsuit. Otherwise, the collector can get a judgment, and then it's much harder to get that overturned. So again, as Richard said, we have resources for this. This is the link for time-barred debts. We have a flyer on that. And there's another brand of debt collector, which is a pure scam. And these are callers seeking to collect a phantom or fake debt. They get consumers' names, and then they claim that they owe a debt, which they never owed. And oftentimes the red flags for this are refusing to give a mailing address. They ask for personal information, or they fish, as we say, for information because maybe actually they are an identity thief, or they threaten you with action that isn't legal to try and scare consumers into paying a debt they don't owe. Consumers are getting calls like that. They need to go back and ask for identification and validation of the debt. If they are sure it's not their debt, just hang up, and don't give any personal information. And if they think it might be a legitimate debt, they can always contact the creditor to find out whether it's a legitimate debt. And anytime, and I don't know if any of us said this, but anytime you have consumers come in with scam problems or identity theft problems or any of the scams that we've mentioned today, they can always report it to us in the state AG's office, and we do act on those when we get a lot of them. And again, here are the websites where they can get information on fake debt collectors and collections on debts owed by deceased relatives, which is another type of scam. Now I'm going to get into the credit issues real fast. A lot of people are having issues with background checks, and they don't know what to do. One of the issues that keeps coming up more and more recently are landlords want to do a background check, and they often come back and tell people, well, you have bad credit, so I don't want to rent an apartment to you. If this happens, they have to give an adverse action notice to the consumer, and the notice has to tell the consumer who created the background or credit report so that the consumer can go and correct it, and if there's a mistake. And so this is really a way for consumers to fix the problem. There are ways too for consumers who have bad credit to get a landlord to rent to them. And oftentimes we tell people, you know, maybe you can show through pay stubs or bank statements, or you could pay that you are a good risk, or maybe offer to pay more for security deposit, or pay the first and last month's rent first in order to secure the housing. And we do have these tear-off sheets. They can be obtained online through consumer.gov, and they're really helpful too. Again, background checks come up in the employment context. There are strict rules for employers. They have to provide a standalone written notice before they do a background check and obtain a written consent. They can't ask about medical information before giving a job offer, and they can't treat people differently because of race, national origin, and the usual suspect categories. Consumers often are upset when they're denied a job based on a background check and they don't know what to do. Employers have to let them know what it was that made the adverse action happen. And usually it's in a credit report, and they have to give the consumer a summary of their rights to show them how to correct an error. Essentially, what consumers need to do is go straight to the credit bureau, and if it's a mistake, and this comes up with identity theft also, they need to get it clarified, and they need to clean it up and notify the consumer of the mistakes. We have resources specifically about background checks that are available free in bulk in English and Spanish, or you can obtain them on our website, and these are joint publications with EEOC and the FTC. So how do consumers correct errors on a consumer report? You can go to the website and there is some confusion about which websites are actually free. The correct website to go to check your credit reports for free is www.annualcreditreport.com. Free reports can be gotten within 60 days to make sure the report's been corrected. And consumers can also stagger asking for the reports because there are 3 credit bureaus, and that way you can check your report every 4 months. We also have resources on this that are very helpful. They walk you through how to dispute errors and how to get free credit reports. Again, something that people often will come in and need. And also, consumers don't always know their rights with regard to credit, so we do have brochures that help lay that out. And again, I believe these are drafted to be for around a high school education, so they should be pretty informative. And of course, you can always send consumers to the FTC, and we will help to resolve problems when we can. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nadine. This is Laura Solis. I'm going to be focusing my portion of the talk on scams that target vulnerable populations. I'm going to forward through some of these slides. There we go. Scams targeting vulnerable populations. So what do we mean by vulnerable populations? Consumers can be targeted specifically because consumers can be disproportionately affected by certain scams. There are some scams that target consumers on purpose, and there are some consumers that, when they are targets of scams, they can suffer greater impacts for a variety of reasons. So this can include consumers who are low income, Latino consumers, African American consumers, Asian American consumers, military consumers, seniors. That's sort of who we're talking about. But I don't want to leave the impression that if you're not in one of those categories, that you're not vulnerable. Because the truth is, scammers really target everybody. And we all have vulnerabilities. One of my vulnerabilities is I will basically buy anything a salesperson tells me to buy. So I have that vulnerability. I know I do, and there's really no sense in sort of getting around it. It's just something that I know. So we all have vulnerabilities, and we can all be vulnerable consumers depending on the certain situation. But we're going to be talking about scammers who target consumers who may be non-fluent English speakers. They may be unfamiliar with US systems or government, and they may be looking for an opportunity to get ahead, which really probably defines most of us. In 2016, the FTC issued a report to Congress, and in that report, we discovered that African American and Latino consumers were more likely to become the victims of fraud than their white counterparts. But at the same time that this is true, they're less likely to report scams and frauds when they're victims. And then 2 types of fraud stood out for its effect on Latino consumers and African American consumers. And that is debt-related fraud and income-related fraud. So it's some of the things we've already talked about. We've talked about credit repair, debt relief, mortgage relief. On the income side, it can be business opportunities, things like pyramid schemes. And then last year, when we're just looking at consumers aged 50 and older, this segment of consumers reported $365 million in losses due to fraud, which was, I think, about 130 million more dollars than consumers under 50 years old. And as consumers age, the median amount of their losses increases. The kinds of scams that we see targeting older consumers are grandparent scams, tech support scams, and sweepstakes scams. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these in the next slide. Our enforcement actions affecting where the scammers were targeting senior consumers include the first 2 cases on this slide, FTC versus NextGen and FTC versus Genius Technologies. These were 2 cases that were filed out of our office last month. They both targeted seniors. NextGen is a sweepstakes scam where defendants sent millions of mailers to consumers that falsely said that consumers had won or were likely to win substantial cash prizes, typically $1 million or $2 million. And what consumers were told is all they had to do is pay a fee between $9 and $139.99. The scammers used official sounding names like Award Notification Commission, International Award Services, or Central Award Distribution. Many people paid the fees several times before realizing that they had been deceived. Collectively, consumers lost more than $110 million as a result of the scam. Ingenious Technologies, our complaint alleged that defendants worked with telemarketers in India to trick older consumers into buying bogus technical support services. They would do this, they would initiate contact with consumers by cold calling them, and also a pop-up would appear on the consumer's computer saying that they needed to call right away if they wanted to get protection from an imminent harm. The callers claimed to be from well-known tech companies, and once they had consumers on the phone, they told consumers that hackers were going to break into their computers very soon and steal their bank accounts if they didn't purchase expensive security software, which they said was affiliated with the US government in many cases, which it was not. In fact, what consumers got downloaded on their computers was worthless or old software. It was available elsewhere for free or for very low cost. While remotely connected to computers, the scammers in this case also took the opportunity to steal information from the consumer's computer. They charged between several hundred to several thousands of dollars. They also, in many cases, when consumers consented to having this software downloaded, the scammers would call again and say, you need to update your software, and they were able to get more money from consumers that way. Several people paid more than $50,000, and one consumer paid almost $400,000 during a period of several years. FTC versus ABC Hispana. Actually, the next three cases on this slide were scammers targeting Spanish-speaking consumers. In the first of those cases, FTC versus ABC Hispana, the scammers worked with callers, telemarketers who were located in Peru, who pretended to be affiliated with the government or with a Centro de Ayuda, which is a non-government help center. They told consumers they had won or had been specially selected to receive a English language learning course. They told consumers that they had qualified for a grant or a scholarship, and that they were going to receive as much as an 80% discount on the fee. They claimed that the course included personal instruction, oftentimes from university professors, as well as a certificate or diploma upon completion of the program. Here, the scammers charged between $199 and $800 for what ended up being, when consumers got the package, was basically self-instruction materials that included booklets and CDs, and in many cases, the stuff that they got didn't even work. But it certainly didn't include any personalized instruction. It wasn't affiliated with the government. They didn't receive a deep discount. They didn't receive scholarships. There was no certificate or diploma. These scammers also had a sort of a second version of the scam, which was the telemarketers would call and pretend to be affiliated with well-known companies like Walmart or Colgate. Or they said that they were calling from a Spanish language radio station and that the consumer had won a prize. And the prize was a tablet computer, top of the line is how they described it. The consumer, all they had to do was pay $200 for what was described as shipping and handling, taxes, insurance, or warranties. Essentially, there was no contest. Consumers got generic tablets or older models, and there was no insurance or warranty. In these cases, what was a common feature of the three cases that we're going to talk about here that were targeting Latino consumers is that consumers were routinely threatened with arrest, jail, referral to law enforcement, they're losing their homes, damage to their credit. In ABC Hispana, the consumers were also given a number that when the consumer called, said that it was the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. Centro Natural was a bogus debt collection scheme, which Nadine has touched on. Consumers were told that they owed thousands of dollars in debt that they didn't owe, and were told that they could pay hundreds of dollars to settle that debt. Consumers were also threatened in this case. And Cream Group, similar situation. This was a work from home scam, where consumers were told that they were going to receive high-end, often designer products for about $400. When consumers opened their packages that they paid for with the money order, they discovered that what was in it was just junk. It was often used clothes, very cheaply made clothes, not brand names, was not a deal at all. And they were not able to resell the products as they were told. Again, this scam also threatened people with legal actions, arrest, and referral to law enforcement authorities. And we were able to get redress for consumers in the Centro Natural case and Cream Group. And we also were able to obtain bans in all of the last three cases. So some of the things you can do to avoid fraud, if we had to boil it down, because I think we're running out of time, if we had to boil it down to the top 3 things you could do, essentially it's slow down. As we have discussed in the sample cases that we talked about, what consumers or what scammers really want is for consumers to not think through a decision. They want to create this false sense of urgency. So for example, in the sweepstakes scams, it's you've won a lot of money. Who couldn't use $1 million like immediately? So consumers have this sense that they have to answer or they have to say yes before they get off the phone. So that is often a trap that scammers use to get consumers to agree to things that they later, when they think about it, it's like, you know what, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Spot imposters is important. How do you do that? Well, imposters basically, as Tina mentioned, pretend to be people that they're not. So they pretend to be trusted friends, relatives, companies that you know and that you do trust. One way to spot an imposter is to be suspicious of unexpected requests. That's where they really try to get you. If it's something that you're not expecting, but you think may be legitimate, hang up the phone and dial the number of the company that you do know and that you do trust and you know it's a good number. You can do online searches. I often use this to search for phone numbers, and you'll find a lot of information from consumers who are posting their experiences online. You can use your favorite search engine, type in scams, complaints, along with the names or the identifying information of the kind, even the kind of scam it is. So IRS fraud or IRS call is a good search term to use if you are suspicious of someone calling you you're not familiar with.
Laura, this is Nono, and I just wanted to interrupt for a second because we're reaching the top of the hour, but I wanted to let any of the attendees who may have to leave at 10 o'clock know that we are recording this and you'll get a copy of the recording. So if we go over and you want to come back and see the end of it, don't worry. Okay, back to you, Laura. Sorry.
Thank you, Nono. Again, so something that a tip that kind of goes throughout each of these 10 points is to talk to someone, and it also relates to the slowdown. Talking to people really helps get your thought process going. It helps you to slow down. It helps to talk to the people who may have had similar experiences or who may sort of clue into something that you weren't thinking about. So talking to someone includes doing online searches and looking for other consumers' experiences. And in many ways, scammers are able to take advantage of people who don't talk to people and who maybe are ashamed of having fallen victim to a scam, and they shut down, and they're trying to keep it secret, and they're trying to work with the company. And in many cases, it ends up working against that consumer because they're not talking to people and they're not having, they're trying to resolve the issue themselves. Finally, sign up for free scam alerts from the FTC at ftc.gov/scams. This is where you can get the most recent information about the kinds of scams that we're seeing, our most recent enforcement actions, and general consumer education updates. I'm going to forward to this slide so we can get through them. This is our Division of Consumer Educate and Business Education develops a great consumer resources, and they do this by learning things about as you can tell, we have a lot of enforcement actions. They distill information and tips that they then turn into great consumer education resources. This is our photo novella line for Spanish-speaking consumers, and I think most, if not all, of these photo novellas are based on actual FTC actions. So they have really practical tips in a way that is very digestible for Spanish-speaking consumers. This is one of our most popular consumer ed pieces when we go to education events where it's predominantly Spanish speakers. There's also information, many of us have already touched on this video, is a multimedia available in Spanish. And as we have discussed, it's important to report fraud to the FTC, particularly for those groups of consumers who are maybe underreporting fraud. So we encourage people to report fraud as it's part of the work that we do. It's part of how we bring enforcement actions. It's part of how we decide what kinds of consumer education we need to do and what kinds of policies we need to focus on. You can do that by going to ftc.gov/complaint. We also have a Spanish version at ftc.gov/queja, and a phone number where people are available to answer the call in Spanish as well as English, 877-FTC-HELP. Finally, there is a library-specific resource page. We've talked a lot about the information that's available on this page, but there's a page specifically for librarians at ftc.gov/libraries where you can use the content that is designed for your programs. There are free written materials, bookmarks and brochures, free videos, as we've seen, to embed in your websites. We've talked about the blog posts. We've talked about the bulk order website. We've talked about consumer.gov. We also maintain the do not call list. You can go to donotcall.gov to report unwanted calls, verify your registration, register your phone number, and your registration does not expire. And I think we open it up if people are still on the phone for any questions that anyone might have.
Yeah, this is Nono, and we had one question come in, which says, and this person has left, so hopefully they'll get back to the recording. It says, what sort of information should you try to get from the caller if you suspect it is a scam?
So are you speaking about, like, as a librarian, if someone is
I think, I don't know the person, again, the person who asked the question has had to leave, so, but I'm assuming that they're probably talking about themselves as an individual. And they can apply that then to tell their patrons. If someone gets a call and you think it's a scam, what kind of information should they try to collect so that they can help the FTC track it down?
So one thing to be suspicious about, again, is it's sort of on the 10 things you can do to avoid fraud is I think one of the questions you should ask is this a call that I was expecting to receive? Are they asking for my personal information? Are they asking me for money? And if it's something that you suspect is a scam, but you're not entirely sure, what you can do is hang up the phone and call, either if it's like, say someone is pretending to be or maybe pretending to be your bank, saying that they need your social security number to verify your account information. You can hang up the phone and call the number that's on your bank statement or somewhere where that that's the actual number. It's really, I think in this day and age, because people can spoof caller ID, this is what happened in some of the cases that we were just talking about. The scammers spoofed the caller ID to make it look like friends and relatives were calling or emergency services was calling. So be suspicious of that. If you look at your phone and you see that it's someone that you may trust, it may not actually be that person. If there's a sort of sense of urgency about what they're asking, I think that's another thing to be suspicious. Don't feel pressured. You can, again, hang up the phone. If they're willing to give you their contact information or whatever information, write it down, plug that stuff into your favorite search engine and see what you can find to see what other consumers' experiences are.
That sounds great. And then I personally had a question, which is, on the do not call list, is there any way to get robocalls Oh, I mean, I swear that's pretty much all the phone calls that come into our landline at my house is robocalls. Is there a way that the do not call list can stop those? Because I thought I was on a do not call list.
This is Nadine. Part of the problem with robocalling is the do not call list works really well for legitimate telemarketers and others who want to call you. But it doesn't work very well for really bad scammers. A lot of the calls that you get that are especially fraudulent robocalls are originating offshore. And we do spend a lot of time trying to trace them, and we have been able to sue many of the really fraudulent robocallers. But the best way for us to deal with that is for you simply to report it. But no, there's no way to really stop them. I mean, you could use caller ID and just not answer, but for someone who gets your phone number and wants to call it, who's a real scammer, they're not going to be registering anyway with the do not call rule.
And the thing we also tell people is that, you know, robocalls are illegal. So if you do get a robocall, just hang up. It is completely illegal to do that. Don't push 1, because I think that oftentimes they have that option, push 1 if you want to get off our list, and people do that, and what happens is they end up getting more calls. So just hang up on robocalls. And I think that there are ways you can call your service provider, your telephone service provider, and get certain numbers blocked, but in many cases, you know, those numbers change, and so that's not a foolproof way to stop the robocalls from happening.
Yeah.
And one way I personally deal with it, which may be too expensive for other people, is we do have a landline, and we also have cell phones. I never give out my cell phone number for anything other than to people and companies that I can trust. Otherwise, I always give my home phone, and about 99% of the calls or more that come to my landline are calls I don't want. So,
yeah, that's the way it is for me too. That's why my landline is almost all junk
and
calls.
that way I'm not constantly getting calls on my cell phone. So that's one option too, is to just have a separate phone number that you just give out when you think it might be something that might get sold.
I actually have a VoIP landline at home that I don't want, but it comes with my package, and they'll charge me more to get rid of it. So it's not actually hooked up, but I do get voicemail on it. I think I'm going to start doing that myself, is just giving that out whenever I don't necessarily want phone calls from the people.
Right, and I give that to some businesses if I know I'm not going to have like a continuing relationship with them, or my relationship is purely one where I go to the store and just buy things in person, because they often do sell your numbers.
That's great. Thank you so much. This has been so informative, and what great resources you have produced. I suspect you're going to be getting some orders for those things for libraries, because this is all really, really useful, excellent material.